Good evening, everyone, and hello and welcome to the Cape Community Water Forum. This evening, we are pleased to have Andrew Gottlieb join us. My name is Madhi Venkatesan. I'm the Executive Director of Sustainable Practices. Most of you know Sustainable Practices through our broadband efforts, but since our founding in 2016, we have had an active educational outreach mission, including an ongoing documentary film series and a podcast radio show. In 2021, due to COVID, we focused on developing educational programming related to various aspects of the Cape. We started off this year in January with the Economics of Sustainability, a 6-part series, which was followed by the Economics of Race. Today, we're really pleased to have community partners with respect to the Cape Community Water Forum, which today is the first of the 4-part series that will go through the month of April. Our community partners helping us in terms of co-sponsoring this event are the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, Sierra Club Cape Cod, 350 Cape Cod, and the Blue Institute Labs. As I noted before, I'm very happy to welcome Andrew Gottlieb. Andrew Gottlieb is the Executive Director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod and has had over 30 years of environmental protection experience in government, as well as elected municipal office. He's been working at all levels of government, serving both local, state, and county capacities. He's a resident of Mashpee and a sitting select person, starting his 4th term, or on his 4th term, if I could say that. He will be speaking specifically with regard to the efforts to protect and preserve the waters of Cape Cod. Please note there is a Q&A aspect to your panel, and please type in any questions you may have during the entire program in that Q&A. We've reserved approximately 20 to 25 minutes for question and answer. Following this program, upon your leaving, you will get a URL popping up on your screen, which will be a survey related to the program itself. We would greatly appreciate your completing it because it helps us in terms of our future programming efforts. So with this introduction, I'm very happy to introduce you to Andrew. And Andrew, please feel free to start to your program. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for having me. It's nice to talk to everybody. So I think any conversation about water on Cape Cod has to start with basic understanding of groundwater and our sole source aquifer. So all the water that we have on Cape Cod, our underground sources of water, are supported by precipitation, whether it's frozen form of snow or rainfall. It finds its way through our sandy soils and recharges our groundwater, where it provides either private drinking water supplies, public drinking water supplies, or the almost 1,000 ponds on Cape Cod, rivers and streams, and our estuarine resources. And all this water that flows from the sky to the ground ultimately finds its way to some surface water. So depending on where you are, the groundwater discharges to the pond, discharges to a river, discharges directly to the estuary, and undergoes some changes in that journey. But one of the important things to realize is that whatever we put in or on the ground will mix with and travel with the water as it passes through the soil. Our freshwater ponds are basically a look into, a mirror into, or window into our groundwater. And so what you see in the surface water environment reflects what's happening underground, where you can't see it. But when it comes up into our surface water features, you can. And I think that one of the things I'd like to share with you to start off with is some work that we've done at APCC, our annual State of the Waters report. And what you'll see from this is that starting with the embayments, red indicates that at least one portion of that embayment has water quality that's unsuitable. And you'll see on the south-facing Cape, the west-facing shore facing Buzzards Bay, and some of the areas on the north-facing side, a lot of red. If you look down in the bottom right corner, you'll see our ponds, and a relatively small number of the 1,000 ponds are included in this data. And again, you'll see a lot of red. And the reason you're seeing that is that I think the single biggest problem we have and challenge we have facing water quality on Cape Cod comes from the fact that we over fertilize our waters. And I don't mean that we take bags of fertilizer and dump them in the water, but we might as well. What we do is three things that are really bad for our water quality. We rely almost exclusively on backyard septic systems in the vast majority of our communities to process and treat our wastewater. Our septic systems were designed for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to prevent human exposure to pathogens. And our septic systems do a very good job of that because our soils are quite sandy. The treated effluent, minimally treated effluent that comes out of your septic system goes into the sand and takes the bacteria. And as you know, when you pour water on sand, typically it just floods away, it goes away, along with those bacteria, which then die off in the soils for the most part. Your septic system is a very efficient conduit for nutrients. Primarily for the marine environment of concern is the nitrogen. Nitrogen is primarily generated by the urine that passes through septic systems. And we are injecting large quantities of human waste with the nutrient load that comes from them into the groundwater, home by home, building by building on a daily basis. And as I started off with the conversation, that water in the groundwater then moves to the nearest surface water feature and ultimately to our marine environment and feeds naturally occurring algae that live in balance with other aquatic vegetation in a healthy bay, and allows those algae to replicate and grow and outcompete other species that provide oxygen, habitat, stability to the subsoils and the bottom of the embayments, and ultimately turns them into very inhospitable, unhealthy resources that can only support the most durable and least diverse forms of marine life. So what did we lose? We lost, and we have lost, our eelgrass, which is highly dependent on clear waters and the penetration of sunshine, both of which are blocked by the algae growth that we're seeing in our estuaries. With the loss of the eelgrass, we've lost the oxygen production that they produce as respirating plants, photosynthesizing the sunlight that reaches the bottom on a daily basis and putting dissolved oxygen into the water, which then supports fisheries of all sorts. We've lost the habitat, the nursery habitat that they provide for finfish and shellfish, in particular scallops. And so we end up with these very unhealthy, aesthetically unpleasing, downgraded water bodies. And you're seeing that across all of southeastern Massachusetts, but nowhere more acute than we're seeing it on south facing Cape Cod. Our ponds are also sensitive to nutrient loads. Again, partly and mostly from septic systems, but also from fertilizer runoff, lawns that are manicured and go right down to the edge of the pond where people are applying large quantities of fertilizers, often non-organic fertilizers, right before the rainstorm, so that when it does rain, they wash right into the pond. And again, what we're seeing in the ponds is an imbalance, an outcompeting of, in the pond freshwater cases, toxic blue-green algae known as cyanobacteria that at certain concentrations can generate toxic toxins that enter the water that are hazardous to people's well-being. They can cause a range of impacts from skin irritation to respiratory illness to organ failure. They are particularly impactful to pets because of the dose quantity and the size of body mass. And what we see in the freshwater ponds is an increase in the cyanobacteria driven more by phosphorus than by nitrogen. But in either instance, we are over fertilizing our water bodies, and we're seeing the decline and loss of those resources has both habitat and recreational opportunities. APCC has begun in the last 4 to 5 years, fairly extensive, but still relatively small given the scale of the problem, monitoring program of freshwater ponds. And what we found is we've looked at more and more ponds, and we looked at about 50 last year. We'll be expanding that program to up to 150 this year with some new funding support that we've been able to get from some of our partners that allows us to increase this program. But what we're finding is more widespread cyanobacteria blooms that start earlier in the year, are more intense and significant than we expected, and last till later in the year and are more widely distributed. So by all measures, presence, severity, and duration, we are finding more than we ever expected and at higher concentrations. And that has resulted in significant number of ponds being closed to public use based on Board of Health regulations and rules to protect people's public health. So a lot of the conversation that you're hearing on the Cape now related to wastewater really speaks to what do we need to do in order to reverse the trends of decline in water quality that we're seeing in both the marine situation and in the ponds. We rely, as I said earlier, way too heavily on septic systems. We have very little infrastructure. 4 of the 15 Cape towns have public wastewater infrastructure serving relatively small percentages of their population. So Falmouth, Barnstable, Chatham, and Provincetown all have some limited wastewater treatment capability. The rest of the communities on the Cape rely exclusively on private wastewater treatment, whether it's a small wastewater treatment facility associated with a golf course, condominium development, strip mall kind of thing, or backyard systems. And the effort that's being undertaken now is to change that practice and come up with the range of options that most cost effectively in a manner that is most conducive to the community character the community wants to retain to manage our wastewater nutrient load. And what you're seeing across the Cape are different efforts scaled at different towns on different time frames to come up with solutions to the nutrient problem. Now, a lot of the work that's being done by towns is being spurred by community activism, people who recognize that they're losing something of value. They're losing the ability to use the water in a way that is consistent with what brought them to the water in the first place. And the loss of that functionality has become something that people are more aware of. Now, one of the interesting things you'll see on Cape Cod is that very early on, one of the most consistent and reliable and useful partners in drawing attention to the environmental problem that we were seeing in our waterways has been the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce and our business community. And for full disclosure, I will tell you all, I'm on the board of the Cape Cod Chamber for the last couple of years. Doesn't change my opinion about them, though. And the reason I bring it up isn't to do a commercial with the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, is to bring up the point that across the spectrum, whether you're an environmentalist or whether you're a a real estate person, a fried clam seller, or a t-shirt company, or a miniature golf place, or an artist studio, there's a common understanding that the reason the Cape is a special place is because of our water quality and the attributes of a clean water environment that bring people to the region. And further, a recognition of the fact that without that reputation for having good water resources, everything upon which all of our economy is built is jeopardized. And you can say, well, I don't have a business on the Cape. I'm retired. I work off Cape, whatever it might be, but I own a home here. If you're like me, and I think typical of most people, our home is the single biggest economic asset that we have. And that a lot of our future plans for retirement, elder care, passing things on to your children it's predicated on the assumption that our home value will remain robust and where it is. That is threatened at the end of the day by poor water quality. So you have a lot of people kind of recognizing that the issue needs to be addressed. And the towns have been a little bit slow in coming around to the party and the recognition that we need to do something. And I will say this to you wearing my selectman's hat for a minute, not because most local officials don't care about water quality or are looking to hurt the environment, but because the solutions to the problems that we're facing are complicated, they're time consuming, and they're really expensive. And because of that combination of factors, if you're an average board of selectmen person, you got elected because you care about your community, you want to get involved. Most people don't have the technical expertise or the background to wade through the complexities associated with dealing with wastewater infrastructure. And because it's expensive, there's a lot of disincentives to moving forward with it. Towns have woken up to their responsibility for a variety of reasons. Part of it is the awakening of the population that live in the communities and the demand that people are making because they're seeing what's happening and they're finally becoming aware of the destruction of their resources. But also because there have been legal challenges and there is a legal framework of state and federal laws, Federal Clean Water Act, State Clean Water Act, that establish standards and have consequences when those standards are not met. And there are third-party organizations that have begun the litigation process that has resulted in significant changes in behavior. First, and significantly, a lawsuit now over a decade old raised the question that the Barnstable County had failed to update something, sort of an esoteric notion, this something called the 208 Water Quality Plan, with reference to Section 208 of the Federal Clean Waters Act of 1972, that requires regions to come up with water quality management plans. And the plaintiffs pointed out correctly that no such update had been done on Cape Cod since 1978. And so the Cape Cod Commission took on the task of updating the 208 plan and came up with what was really very much a transformative document that changed the conversation on the Cape, or helped to change the conversation on the Cape about wastewater management, and it allowed us to have a framework to think about wastewater in a way that's different from you just sewer everything, because you just sewer everybody, every house, every building, every town was a decade ago, and nothing has gotten less expensive, an $8 billion exercise. And that number in and of itself stopped people in their tracks. And in fact, gave people a reason to say, we can't do that because we simply don't have the money on Cape Cod in order to do that. The 208 plan looked at ways that we could bring that cost down by relying on alternative technologies, alternative approaches to managing wastewater, whether it was inlet modification, reliance on shellfish, increasing flushing, restoration of natural habitats to take nutrients out of the environment before they reach the marine environment, plus targeted sewering, towns working together to share facilities, get the greatest bang for their buck. That all helped bring the cost down to a still expensive but more manageable $4 billion. And that 208 plan laid out a framework that said, about half of that cost can be borne over a generational period by the local rate base. The other half has to come from a combination of state and federal funding sources. Well, the state stepped up recently and provided the Cape with the opportunity to have zero interest loans for their wastewater projects, which is an enormously valuable financing tool that has greatly lowered the cost of financing infrastructure and made it more affordable for the Cape. But it also created something called the Cape and Islands Water Protection Trust Fund, which is funded by a 2.75% surtax on overnight stays of less than 30 days. So when you rent your house out, you collect a 2.75% surcharge. That money goes to the Cape and Islands Trust. That money is then distributed back to towns in the form of subsidies on loans that you're getting from the state to bring down the principal payment. I bring these things up because over time, since the 208 study and litigation that spawned it began, we now have financing tools available to us that we didn't have before. And that has stripped away a lot of the reasons why local officials were hesitant to move forward with projects, and has resulted in the movement of significant wastewater infrastructure programs in a number of towns. The town of Orleans broke ground on their downtown sewer project to bring some relief to their strained estuaries. Town of Harwich is doing construction of wastewater facility or sewer mains to tie into the town of Chatham, representing a municipal partnership that saves both communities money. The town of Mashpee, my community, is moving forward at town meeting, asking our voters for approval of $54 million capital construction program to build a wastewater treatment plant and associated sewers. And because we have utilized the tools that have been made available to us, whether it's the zero interest loans, the water infrastructure fund, state principal forgiveness, we set aside our local tax revenue from the local share for the hotel motel tax into a reserve fund to offset wastewater costs. And because we created a water infrastructure fund and a model that's very similar to what we are all doing with community preservation, we're able to ask our voters on May 3rd for a $54 million borrowing authorization that will not raise 1 penny of local taxes beyond what's already authorized. So we now have these tools available to us to move these projects forward. And, I think that we are on the cusp of seeing a improvement in the nutrient loading that we're providing to our estuaries, and begin to see, as we track our water quality over year, what we're still seeing right now is that more red dots, because we haven't really begun treating that much wastewater, and because it takes time for these environmental interventions to begin to be seen in an improved water quality. But over time, once we start these on a more broad-based basis, I think it's reasonable to expect that our annual report is going to start to show more and more blue, because what we do know is that when we stop the insult, our water resources have the opportunity and the ability to reverse their decline and get better, not worse. So I want to point out to you a little bit on the bottom left, the public water supplies. And what you see is there are 20 public water suppliers on Cape Cod, municipal districts and the like. And we evaluate based on the consumer confidence reports that the water suppliers have to do to comply with their federal drinking water standards every year. We review those, and what we found is that the finished water quality being provided, putting into the public water supply systems by each of our public water suppliers is excellent. And it's an interesting contrast to what you see on the surface water side. And it's a fair question to ask yourself why that is. And there's actually, in my mind, a fairly easy answer. Back in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, during the initial really significant building boom that we experienced on Cape Cod, there was a general public consensus about the importance of protecting water supplies. And towns very aggressively began the process of identifying the areas that protect their public well sites. They identified areas that had the potential to serve as future public water supply sites. They acquired aggressively open space around those well sites, and they put in restrictive zoning, wellhead protection zoning, to ensure that the land uses around those water supplies would not ultimately impact those water supplies. So there was a public consensus around the importance of managing your water supply, and we took public action, expended public resources with an objective in mind of protecting the public water supply. That's not to say there have not been occasions where there have been contamination incidents in public water supplies, because we do have contamination in groundwater on Cape Cod. But as a general rule, and the results show it, we have done a pretty good job managing our public water supply resources. That contrasts significantly with the lack of management and therefore the lack of a consensus around the need to manage the land that provides recharge to our surface water features, whether they're ponds or whether they are estuaries. Um, and, when you invest and protect, you see that the resource responds and provides high quality waters to our drinking water suppliers. And that's to our benefit. When we don't value, don't protect, the result you see here is a lot of red. And there's a lesson to be learned here. We've done a lot of damage. We've let a lot of bad things happen, but the opportunity still exists to reverse those trends. And once we have reversed them, to behave in a manner that indicates a greater respect for and sensitivity of the water resources that help define community character and make Cape Cod an attractive place to be. So I look at the public water supply as a success story, not without its challenges. And our stewardship of our surface water features to largely be an abject failure. And we've known it for a long time. And it has only been through the work of a lot of hard work by a lot of people over the last decade that we have come to a realization of what we have done to our surface water features and be on the cusp of being able to make the investments necessary to see a return to the water quality that brought a lot of us here. As we proceed, we operate at APC under the premise that decisions made to manage nutrient loads to our surface water bodies are best and most cost effectively and appropriately made at the local level by the local folks. And that the best way for a community to continue to have control over what it needs to do, how it's going to do it, and over what time period and at what cost, is to move forward with their wastewater management programs. And I say that because the reality is there are state and federal laws that apply here. And there are environmental organizations that stand ready to press the case that the Cape is out of compliance. And I will tell you, they have a pretty good case. And I tell you that as a potential defendant, as a municipal official in a possible litigation, should our project on May 3rd not proceed. I'm not telling any secret that I haven't said enough in public that I'm worried about it hurting our case. They have a claim. The environmental community has a case. There are laws that say we need to do a better job, and we should be doing a better job. And one of the most compelling arguments in my mind about why communities should invest now in long-term infrastructure improvements that result in improved water quality is that when you go before a judge and you're found to not meet the letter of the law, the judge's interest is in one thing and one thing only. The judge's interest is in getting you back into compliance. But what's the easiest way to get back into compliance? If you're the judge, you want one facility where you measure compliance at the end of a pipe. You don't want to hear about innovative alternative systems. You don't want to hear about how much nitrogen is consumed by an individual oyster. You don't want to hear about how many oysters have been taken out of a given body of water, and that results in X pounds of nitrogen being removed. You don't want to hear about natural attenuation. You don't want to hear about any of it. What you want is a defendant to get in compliance as quickly as they can, because your job as the judge isn't to worry about what the community is going to look like, isn't to worry about how the community is going to pay for what you tell them they need to do, is to get them in compliance with the law. So the history of Clean Water Act federal litigation across the United States since 1972 is that when you are under a court order, you get the job done, but you get it done in a manner that is more expensive, on a lot shorter time frame, and at much more community disruption than you would want if you were managing it your own. So our message to our local partners and our friends across the communities is the best way you can manage and control your future is to actually take charge of it. and start these programs, start these projects, take advantage of the funding tools, because you can do it better for your community than if a judge tells you how to do it. And so the days of us behaving on Cape Cod, like our ability to deal with this issue is a discretionary choice that we have to make. And beyond being a discretionary choice, one that if we choose to take it up, we choose to take it up at the time and place of our choosing, those days are over. We rode that horse for a long time. It got us a lot of dirty water, and it created an enormous legal and therefore financial exposure to our communities that as responsible local officials, we can no longer say to our taxpayers and voters that we are doing the best thing we can in the best interest of our community by not taking this issue up. So yes, I know schools have needs, fire departments have needs, police have needs, elder services have needs, and our resources have needs. And it's time to stop putting protection of the environment, restoration of our waters behind all those other things. There are actually more diverse and creative ways to finance what we need to do on the water side than there are for some of those other tasks. And there really is no excuse anymore. You have a track record. Chatham has moved ahead with a community-wide sewering program. Mashpee's on the cusp of doing it. Orleans is doing it. Harwich is doing it. Falmouth is moving on theirs. Yarmouth is working on theirs. Other communities are making progress where progress did not seem possible or likely a few years ago. So there are possibilities and there are opportunities here, and we do have an obligation to act. And I'll close by just raising one other issue. You may have seen and may be concerned about a class of compounds called PFAS, PFOAs, fluorinated compounds, forever chemicals, Teflon, Rain Guard, Stain Master. These are chemicals that are ubiquitous in manufactured products and packaging. They show up in industrial processes. They show up in firefighting foams. They're everywhere. They're in you, they're in me, they're in every single one of us. I read somewhere where 95% of the mammalian population of the world has measurable PFAS compounds in the blood. And you're going to hear more about it. And the reason you're going to hear more about it is that drinking water regulations went into effect in Massachusetts on April 1st that require small and medium-sized water systems to start testing for perfluorinated compounds. Only 6, and there are dozens of them, if not hundreds. No one's really sure because they're proprietary and the manufacturers don't tell us. You are going to hear more about the presence of these compounds at low levels in drinking water everywhere, not just Cape Cod, not just Massachusetts, but across the country as these rules go into effect and people start looking. And there are no easy answers. They are known as forever chemicals because they're enormously stable. That's why a Teflon pan works for a long time. You can't burn it off. And they are extremely water soluble. So once they're in the environment, they move and they bioaccumulate. So you're going to start to hear more about that. And I don't offer any easy answer on what to do about it. I will caution you a couple of things. One is your drinking water is not your sole source of exposure. So by cutting off the drinking water exposure, you're lowering your potential exposure in dosing, but you're not eliminating it. And how one eliminates it is a very difficult question to which I do not have a particularly good answer. The other thing is think long and hard before you seek alternative sources of water, in particular bottled waters. Whole range of issues around the packaging in bottled waters, but the regulatory regimen for bottled waters is very different than what you find for public drinking water supplies. Drinking water supply PFAS compound levels are measured in parts per trillion. Bottled water is often measured in parts per billion or parts per million, depending on the compound. So you can get very low or no detect levels at the measure that they're looking at and still have water that in a bottle might actually contain higher levels of perfluorinated compounds than what you're concerned about drinking from a municipal water supplier. So you need to educate yourself on this issue, and you need to think carefully. You'll hear from a lot of people about opportunities, treatment technologies, and under the faucet systems. And I just encourage you to be concerned, but move cautiously, so you don't inadvertently spend a lot of money to either not solve your problem or create another set of risk factors that you might not want to deal with. So that's something that's going to start to trickle out into the news over the next several months. My Mashpee Water District has begun the testing process early, and they're going to have hits. We already know it. And it's so it might happen here first, but it's coming to a water supplier near you as well. So on that down note, I'm going to turn it back over to the host, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We do have a few questions, and I will begin with the first one, but I would like to invite everyone who is on this webinar to please go ahead and post your question in the Q&A. If we don't have an opportunity to answer the question this evening, we will post answers when we accompany the actual tape version of this on our website, sustainablepracticesltd.org. This will also be carried on Bourne, Mashpee, Sandwich, and Lower Cape TV stations, and we will send out the replay following the webinar. The first question is coming from John Dugan, who notes, what is the relative contribution of chemical lawn and garden fertilizers to water quality degradation relative to the contribution of human waste?
Okay, so for the marine waters, the general rule of thumb is about 85% of the controllable nitrogen load to our marine waters comes from human septic waste. The remaining 15%, about 2/3 of that is lawn fertilizers for residential or commercial property use. The balance is stormwater. So I don't have a similar number that I'm confident in for the freshwater environments. Our data set and our understanding of water quality is significantly less in the freshwater environments than it is for the marine side. I suspect that the majority remains septic waste, but that the percentage of fertilizer runoff contributing to water quality problems in lakes is a little bit higher because of the propensity that people have to remove the vegetative buffer along their shoreline and grow turf grass very close to the water's edge and fertilize that turf grass. I will tell you the easiest thing to do, and what we like to say in many cases is, green lawn gets you a green pond. And so we have a lot of information on the APCC website that talks about the restoration of a more Cape centric landscape approach, restoration and replacement of the use of cultivated plants towards things that are native to Cape Cod, that are acclimated to our nutrient poor sandy soils, that don't require or even want you to fertilize them, that do well in sandy soils, that don't require the watering, the pesticides, provide better habitat for other native species of birds and insects upon which the ecosystem relies, and to really minimize your lawn. We have a good series on Kill Your Lawn. Go back to sort of the traditional Cape Cod lawn of sort of a nice mix of crabgrass, clover, and moss to provide ground covers, but don't really look to fertilize and create a putting green on your lawn. Eliminating the nutrient load from fertilizers is always the best practice and one we recommend everybody do. In and of itself, for most water quality problems we've seen, it will not be sufficient by itself without some wastewater management improvements. But in all cases, it makes sense to minimize the load as best you can for the discretionary applications that come associated with fertilizers. It's a really cheap solution. You have to spend money to buy fertilizer to put it down to pollute your water body. It's not like spending the money to build wastewater treatment infrastructure. You just don't have to spend the money, and you get the benefit of not spending the money on the fertilizer and having a healthier pond as a result.
The next question I have is, what can we do in terms of daily life to protect our Cape Cod waters?
I think we already just talked a little bit about, improving your land use practices and relying more heavily on native species. I'll direct people to our apcc.org website for a lot of guidance on that. And we do run a bunch of programs on it that can help educate you. Be cognizant that whatever you put down the drain and put down the toilet ends up in your water. And so, if you took a sample out of pretty much anywhere, you're going to find caffeine, prescription medications, all sorts of stuff that either people put right down the drain or that you ingest in your body and it's excreted in your waste and it shows up in the water. So be mindful that what you put down the drain and what you put on the land ends up in the water. If you need to fertilize, use organic compounds. Use less. Ideally, use none. And look for alternatives to caustic cleaners. Look for alternatives to petroleum-based cleaners. Those things all have a life that goes beyond what your use of them and perpetuate in the environment. The other thing to realize is that there's a lot of market out there for septic additives that are supposed to make all this bad stuff go away. They don't work. Don't put them down your drain. Don't waste your money. Just be mindful of what goes down your drain.
That question came from Carla Cabral. I'm going to couple two questions together. One is from Alan Waxman, who's specifically asking about phosphorus runoff to freshwater ponds. He's asking if it's been reduced as a result of updated fertilizer laws. This is coupled with one related to golf courses. So what can be done to minimize the impact of golf courses? So I'm going to give them both to you because I think they're fairly related.
They are. The issue of local regulation of the application of fertilizers is a particularly frustrating one. The state Department of Agricultural Resources several years ago implemented a rule that preempts local regulatory authority to establish standards for the application of fertilizers in your community. 9 of the 15 towns on Cape Cod adopted local control bylaws prior to that state preemption, but any community that did not or seeks to significantly revise those rules is precluded from doing so by the state. You could argue, well, why the hell did they do that? The influence of the industry, the lawn care industry, is a significant industry. And much like other issues of local control, they don't like having 351 standards to meet in 351 different communities. So there's often very much an argument made to the state regulatory agencies by the trades that there ought to be state minimums or state standards and that ought to apply to everybody. And the truth of the matter is that the state standards for application of fertilizers aren't very good. And they aren't adequate to protect our sandy soils. The Cape is different in that our soils are very permeable and atypically so compared to the rest of the state. So issues of the migration of compounds, whether it's fertilizers, chemicals, nutrients on the Cape are more extreme than experienced elsewhere. And so the state regulatory process doesn't always recognize very well the degree of sensitivity of our resources. And we are oftentimes penalized or held back as a result of being as sensitive a resource as we are with the type of geology that we have. Golf courses are, they are a confounding issue. You will hear from the golf community, we only put down as little as we need to in order to achieve the result that we have. And the homeowners put down way more than we do on a per acre basis because they don't know what they're doing and we do. And there's some truth to that. But golf courses are large monocultures. They're non-diverse environments, and they rely on a lot of pesticides, a lot of fertilizers, and a lot of management of the land that is not necessarily all that ecologically friendly. So, I don't think you could get rid of all the golf courses and you'd minimize or reduce the problem to some extent. You wouldn't solve it. But they're clearly not an environmental benefit from a nutrient management and a pesticide management perspective.
I'm going to couple a couple of other questions together. One from, I believe it's Kevin Kukler, and forgive me if I've said the name incorrectly. And I'm going to couple that with another question related to water testing from John Frost. So the first question is related specifically to the studies by Silent Spring that have gone out, and specifically they're related to private wells. A lot of their testing has been with regard to private wells, and they have sent out an alert on that, but that's very different from municipal water in terms of testing. So they're asking specifically, what about human health and the relationship between quality of private water supplies? And the second question that's related to this is, what water quality tests are being made on ponds? So I'm just coupling those together because in both cases, those are not part of the municipal water source.
Sure. All right. There's a lot there to unpack. The degree of testing of ponds is pretty meager. So in coming up with the analysis I showed you, we had some data standards. It said we weren't going to we needed at least 3 years of sampling data in the pond, and the most recent had to be since 2015. We were only able to evaluate 29 of the 956 ponds on the Cape using that relatively loose standard. And even within that, most of the testing that's done in these ponds is done once or twice a year for a relatively limited number of parameters. So the data set's terrible. And it gets back to what I was saying about the fact that we never really valued our ponds. So we don't know very much about them. So it's not very good. We at APCC have been working with our partners, the Cape Cod Commission, and are going to be presenting a proposal to the county commissioners in the near future to launch a water quality program for our freshwater ponds that is a similar scale, complexity, and scope as to what's been done on estuaries for the last decade, because we recognize the data gap is significant. We really don't know that much about our ponds. Most of the ponds that we were able to evaluate and will continue to evaluate have benefited from the sampling we do for the cyanobacteria, which is much easier for us to do. But as I said, we only did 50 ponds last year. We're tripling our program to go to 150 this year. That's still only 15%. We'll have activity in each one of the 15 towns, but I will tell you, we're proud of what we're doing. We're happy we're able to expand, but we at the same time recognize it's not enough. In terms of the Silent Spring work, and I will say this as a private well owner, most of us don't have a clue what's in our water. The testing in order to get a private well permit is relatively minimal. It doesn't include a significant range of organic compounds. Certainly doesn't include any of the unregulated compounds that you see people like Silent Spring worrying about. And there is no mandated requirement to supplementally test after your well is in place. So most people who have private wells have no clue. Public water supplies do have the benefit that they are routinely tested. You know a lot more about what the water quality is coming out of the public supply pipe than you do on the private well side. I would say that the sensitivity of our marine waters to nitrogen is many-fold greater than the human health sensitivity to nitrate. Nitrate standard for human health is 10 parts per billion. It's largely driven by concerns about blue baby syndrome. And so most of our waters are well below 5. And most of them are, substantially below 5. The nitrate levels are going up, driven by septic systems. But I don't tend to view the nitrate levels as a first order public health threat for private drinking water supplies right now. The bigger issue are the volatile organic compounds, the perfluorinated compounds, and the combined activity that you're seeing around a mixture of low-level chemicals that are in the groundwater as a result of it passing through the septic systems.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We have a few questions related specifically to municipal water and water testing. I'm going to, given the time constraints, I'd really like to ask those individuals who are interested about municipal water testing to come back next week. We'll have Dan Pelletier of the Harwich Water Department speaking specifically about municipal water testing. I'm going to change the course, the directions, and maintain it to the areas that Andrew has been an advocate. So the first question we have here is with Kathy Fox Alfano, and she's asking specifically with regard to discharge into the Cape Cod Canal. And basically it's a discharge issue related to Mass Maritime Academy. And she's concerned about the nitrogen load that's being dumped into the canal. And she's wondering, is it something that EPA has oversight over, or what are the necessary mechanisms that are available to protect the discharge levels?
Yeah, so this is a question that it's not entirely right for an answer yet, in that there's a conceptual plan to consolidate the Wareham Regional Wastewater Treatment Facility at Taylor's Point and Buzzards Bay. There's a lot of planning and evaluation that needs to happen before there's sufficient data out there to determine what the real impacts of this particular outfall location would be. To narrowly answer your question, because it would be a surface water discharge into waters of the United States, it would require both a state and federal surface water discharge permit. So both DEP and EPA will have to issue permits for that project. The permitting process is, I would suggest, at least 2 years away from being commenced. So there isn't enough information out there for them to even file a permit application, let alone have it be evaluated one way or the other. So stay tuned, stay on that one. We have concerns about utilizing that location as well.
Both John and Bonnie had the same question, which is, are there any actions that citizens can undertake to test ponds on their own?
There are some citizen volunteer programs out there. I would suggest that the best way for you to proceed, if you're interested in having some work done on your pond, is to contact our office. Kevin Johnson at apcc.org runs our lake monitoring program. We do have some remaining capacity to take on some additional ponds for cyanobacteria monitoring. And so we may in fact be coming to your pond because we're already expanding our program. But I would suggest that you give Kevin a call. You can find him on our website. And I would also suggest, people that want to do some pre-reading for your session next week on public water supplies, go to our State of the Waters report. We do have a fairly expansive discussion on water quality in drinking water supplies, and you can gain access to all the consumer confidence reports filed by your community, so you can arm yourself with some information and questions in preparation for that meeting.
I have two questions I'm going to put together. One is from Brian Miner. He's asking the macro view in terms of number of towns with wastewater infrastructure coming up for this town meeting and the combined dollars involved. And then the other question that's related to this is, forgive me, I lost the spot. So hopefully I can get it in 1 second. If I can't, then we'll just go to this one question. Let's just go to that one question.
Brian's. So there's, off the top of my head, I know that Falmouth, Chatham, Mashpee, at a minimum, are bringing projects before their town meeting this year for wastewater infrastructure. The dollar value, I'm not sure, Brian. I know mine is 54 million. And I will say that the Cape and Islands Water Protection Trust is poised next week to consider providing funding support to a number of projects that represent about a 25% subsidy, amounting to about $96 million to a variety of Cape communities that have moved wastewater projects forward since 2018 up to what's proposed this current year. So there is a lot of activity. Now I don't have the exact number of what's on town meeting warrants this spring other than my own.
Ari Stemetiou asks, and I know Ari, and I hope I didn't say his name incorrectly, his last name. It asks specifically about cranberry bogs because the discussion so far has been related to nitrogen load from septic tanks as well as issues related to fertilizer use. But what about cranberry bogs?
Cranberry bogs are a source of nutrients. You know, how much I don't know. You know, they're a contributing factor. I will say that they're an easy, obvious target. A lot of them have been around a long time. Have been contributing nutrients to the system for a long time. It's not until we loaded up the landscape with all the residential development that we passed over the tipping point for a lot of these systems. That's not to say the cranberry bogs don't have a share in the responsibility and should be mitigating and managing their nutrient load as much as possible. But it's a combined issue. You know, it's easy. I guess what I'm saying is it's easy to say, let's get rid of the golf course, let's get rid of the agriculture when we solved our problem. We can't solve it that way. It's not enough to solve it that way. And so, you know, we should be looking at where the nature of the real problem is that we need to solve in order to actually make progress. And that has to include improvements in the residential nutrient load beyond what we have now.
We have a few more minutes left, and I'm just going to give you probably one question coupled and then maybe two more questions after that, Andrew. This one's coming from Joanne Hollander and Gary Senecal. Joanne asked specifically, shouldn't we be concerned about cleaning our water table? And Gary's requesting information with regard to whether we should be concerned at this point in time with regard to our Cape's sole source aquifer.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's in many respects, that's what we have been talking about. You know, everything that we're putting into the ground gets into the aquifer and finds its way into drinking water or surface water feature. So, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what we need to be doing is, you know, improving our land use practices, because whatever we're doing on the surface of the land affects the water quality, and we see it once it emerges in our tap water or in our drinking water supply or in our ponds or estuaries.
On April 22nd, we will be talking specifically about the Cape Cod sole source aquifer, looking at the geology of the aquifer, so that might make it a little bit more clear to some of you with regard to some of the unique attributes of it. So we invite you to come back for that discussion. I have two more questions that I like to give you. One is related specifically to Joint Base Cape Cod, the issues with proposed machine gun range expansion and its impact on water quality.
Yeah, we're quite concerned about the impact of the machine gun range, and there's a lot on our website about it. You can find a rather detailed comment letter that I actually don't have time to summarize in the time we have left. But suffice to say that this project feels like it's one that environmental analysis is being used to justify a predetermined outcome, as opposed to search for answers and come up with ways to mitigate what the possible impacts are. It's the single largest clear cut on Cape Cod in anyone's living memory. And the National Guard Bureau is saying it has no significant impact on water supply and no significant impact on climate change. Neither one on their face is a legitimate conclusion. And we have commented to that effect. The Guard has signaled their intent to validate their finding of no significant impact, and shows every indication they plan to proceed. I encourage anybody who's concerned about that, go on our website, read about it. We launched a tool today that enables you to, just by filling in your name and address information, directly communicate with our congressional delegation, urging them to intervene on behalf of the protection of the resource. So the more they hear from us and from you about that, the more likely we are to be able to put the brakes on this, so that if it does proceed, it can proceed with a reasonable amount of mitigation that will protect our resources, because what they're proposing now just simply doesn't cut it.
I'm going to end with a question that's addressed to both of us, and that way we can conclude following. And the question is from Irene. Andrew, do you and Madhavi drink your own town water, or do you use an alternative source for your drinking water? If an alternative, which one?
You want to go first?
I'll let you go first because I'll have to close out to the webinar that way.
I have a private well and I drink it without treatment and without reservation. We get it tested on an annual basis for a fairly wide range of constituents. And it's, high quality water that I'm comfortable drinking.
Irene, I drink my town's water, which is Brewster Tap, and they actually have a tap campaign. We believe in our organization to drink our municipal water. It is the water that you actually know what is in it, because there is a water quality report for most communities if you're drinking municipal water as opposed to well water. But if you have well water, you have an opportunity to do a potability test. There are many reasons to drink your own municipal water. One of those could be very simply an emerging concept called water justice, which means when you're drinking water that you're buying in a transactional nature in a store, you're depleting somebody else's water resource rather than actually managing your own. So we actually focus in our organization, Sustainable Practices, on actually promoting people's management of our commons. In other words, having enough respect for one another to manage our common resources. And we hope that will be a value that we continue to push forward. So with that, we'd like to conclude. First, I'd like to say thank you very much to Andrew. Thank you so much for participating this evening and answering so many questions. And it's obvious that there's a lot of interest on this issue. And again, as Andrew has noted, please visit the APCC website to find out more information, because there's a lot of information that's probably very important to many of you to know. And one thing we're very fortunate is that Andrew does make regular speaking engagement opportunities around the Cape. So if you have a question that was not answered today, I'm sure that if we don't answer it later in our series, Andrew is available on other occasions to answer them. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate everybody's time and attention. You can find us at apcc.org and email me if you have a question. I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of these issues.
Thank you all very much. And with that, we conclude today's program.
Good night.
Good night.